Mark Wahlberg confronts a bully at a bar. The twist will blow your mind. Mark Wahlberg pushes open the heavy wooden door of the tucked-away Boston bar, relishing the wave of warmth that rushes out to meet the chill of the autumn night as he steps inside. His senses immediately alive with the hum of distant conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft glare of dimmed overhead lights, all promising a momentary escape from the electric roar of the city. He inhales deeply, detecting the aged scent of oak mingling with a faint trace of cigar smoke lingering in the rafters, stirring memories of his youth spent navigating similar neighborhood haunts. Treading across the worn, creaking floorboards, he feels a sense of comfort in the bar's gentle heartbeat. An old jukebox softly croons a forgotten rock classic, and the few patrons scattered about cast brief, curious glances in his direction, not quite sure if they recognize him but quietly intrigued by his presence. He catches his reflection in the crooked mirror behind the bar, noticing a subtle tiredness in his eyes that reveals the weight of back-to-back film commitments, early morning workouts, and countless promotional interviews that have consumed his life for what feels like an eternity. Seeking some respite, he slides onto a sturdy wooden stool at the counter, nodding at the bartender with a polite, easygoing smile, silently signaling a need for a moment of calm before ordering. Even as he sits, he can't help but scan the room, his natural vigilance honed by years of working out, training for various movie roles, and being brought up in a neighborhood where caution had been second nature. He surveys the collection of battered tables, some scarred by old knife marks and etched hearts that had long since lost their romantic origin stories, and a few empty booths on the far wall illuminated by hanging lamps that create halos of golden light in the otherwise dusky interior. At one table, a couple leans in, foreheads nearly touching, whispering conspiratorially as if the rest of the world ceased to exist once they stepped into their private circle of conversation. At another, a trio of middle-aged men talk in hushed, urgent tones, their expressions occasionally lighting up with brief bursts of laughter that vanish as quickly as they appear, each one nursing a well-worn pint as though the act of drinking was habitual, mechanical even. In the corner, near a flickering neon sign advertising a defunct local beer, a tall figure stands with arms folded, scanning the bar with a certain heaviness to his gaze, emanating an aura of brooding solitude that sends a faint tremor of unease through the otherwise tranquil setting. Mark momentarily averts his eyes from the lone figure, focusing instead on the smooth texture of the polished bar top and thinking of the hundreds, maybe thousands, of stories that have played out in this cozy, worn-down establishment over the years. He wonders if the people here come seeking solace, adventure, or perhaps an escape from the trials of everyday life, just as he has tonight, eager to melt into the anonymity of a dimly lit corner. The bartender, a wiry man with graying hair and a sincere smile, gently interrupts Mark's reverie, sliding a bottle of locally brewed lager across the counter, as if offering a piece of the city's soul in liquid form. Mark nods in thanks, lifting the bottle in a small toast to no one in particular, savoring the refreshing bitterness of the first sip, the subtle fizz coating his tongue. He closes his eyes for an instant, letting the modest hum of conversation and the croon of an old singer envelop him, imagining, if only for a brief moment, that time could stand still in the presence of such comforting familiarity. The second sip feels more relaxed, as though the fizz of the beer is coaxing away the tension in his shoulders, prompting him to settle more comfortably on the bar stool. Despite his desire for anonymity and a fleeting sanctuary, he can't shake the slight tingle of restlessness that accompanies the possibility of being recognized, whether by a longtime fan, a curious barfly, or, as he's encountered many times, someone looking to pick a fight simply for the chance to say they did. The bartender, attuned to his patron's moods, catches Mark's eye and offers a friendly grin, the kind that wordlessly communicates acceptance and respect for each visitor's wish to remain unbothered. A series of laughs erupts from a corner table, and Mark feels a strange sense of comfort in hearing genuine warmth amidst the sea of hushed tones, as if the outburst of mirth reaffirms that, at least for tonight, this place can still hold onto hope and camaraderie despite whatever personal struggles each patron carries within. He can't help but let his mind drift, revisiting the footsteps that led him here tonight, replaying the myriad obligations of his schedule and the countless times he's had to be on, whether on set or in the public eye, always performing and seldom able to just be. The weight of that reflection is unexpectedly heavy, reminding him how rare these solitary escapes have become, how seldom he finds moments to slip away from the demands of fame and simply exist as Mark rather than Mark Wahlberg, the movie star. He looks around again, noticing the warm glow of the overhead lights reflecting off the edges of the liquor bottles lined up behind the bar, each label telling its own story of far-off distilleries and local breweries. An ancient dartboard with missing segments and a few half-buried darts clings to the far wall, a testament to countless friendly, and maybe not-so-friendly competitions that took place long before he arrived. The battered pool table near the front window, its felt torn in one corner, stands as silent evidence of past boisterous gatherings, empty now except for a stray cue leaning against the wall. Mark notices that the tall, brooding figure has shifted from one foot to the other, as if wrestling with an internal dialogue, and for a fleeting moment, he senses a current of tension in the air, easily missed if one isn't accustomed to scanning a room for potential trouble. Yet Mark tries to brush it off, reminding himself that not everyone who appears guarded is looking for conflict. Sometimes people carry burdens that overshadow their demeanor. Another wave of laughter resonates behind him, cutting through the subtle press of bodies, the clank of glassware, and the hum of the jukebox's fading tune. He forces his attention back to his drink, which is already halfway gone. Though he doesn't recall drinking that much, an unspoken testament to how lost in his thoughts he's become since walking through the door. The bartender reappears, this time placing a small bowl of pretzels next to him, a gesture that feels unexpectedly kind and fosters an odd sense of belonging, as if it's a silent promise that in this space, no matter who you are, you're offered a token of welcome. Mark offers another silent nod, grateful for the simple acts of hospitality that can sometimes feel all too rare in the bigger, busier bars across the city, where anonymity is routine but warmth is often absent. The overhead light flickers, just once, but enough to draw Mark's gaze upward, giving him a split-second glimpse of the bar's aged rafters, cobwebbed corners, and the layered paint that's chipped away over generations. He wonders how many souls have found refuge here in the past, how many heartbreaks, celebrations, disappointments, and ephemeral joys have unfolded within these walls. From the corner of his eye, he notices the tall figure tilt his head slightly, almost as though checking the crowd for something or someone. Mark's instincts, honed by experiences both on-screen and off, prompt him to file the observation away, but he refuses to let it pierce his moment of tranquility just yet. Instead, he distracts himself with the sweet salty taste of pretzels, the crunch serving as a small pleasure that provides a contrast to the weight of his thoughts. The jukebox switches tracks, launching into a sentimental ballad that fills the bar with melodic longing, reminding Mark of the intangible complexities that shape the human experience. The regrets left unsaid, the dreams that cling to hope, and the fleeting beauty of a night like this, where anything can happen. He listens intently to the lyrics, almost imagining them as a soft lamentation for the parts of himself he rarely displays, a reflection on the roles he's taken, both personally and professionally, and the pieces of his identity that remain hidden behind the public persona. He finishes his bottle and contemplates ordering another, wanting to prolong this rare moment of solitude, but wary of indulging too much in the easy lull of alcohol. With a mild shrug, he signals for a second round, reasoning that one more drink might help ease the lingering knots in his shoulders, a minor indulgence in a life carefully calibrated by workout routines, meal plans, and contract obligations. The bartender, attentive as ever, has already begun to uncap a fresh bottle before Mark even fully commits to the order, reading him like a well-worn page in a familiar novel. In the gentle candlelight dancing on the tables, Mark sees an almost nostalgic panorama of a city that raised him, welcomed him back, and sometimes rejected him, but never ceased to shape him, forging that distinct blend of grit and compassion he carries everywhere. Another subtle glance at the tall man in the corner reveals a slight turn of his torso, and though Mark can't see the figure's face fully, he notices the tension in the man's posture, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. A distant alarm bell rings in Mark's mind, cautioning him to keep his wits about, to remain vigilant, even in this brief reprieve from the high-intensity world he left outside. Nonetheless, Mark tells himself that maybe the man is just another weary soul seeking sanctuary, grappling with the ghosts of his day and the shadows of his past in the only way he knows how. He rubs a hand across his chin, feeling the slight stubble there, recalling the early call time he has in the morning, and briefly debates whether he should leave now to secure a decent night's sleep. The notion of stepping back into the cold, swirling night air, returning to the shell of obligations that dominate his existence, clashes against the alluring promise of just a few more minutes in this time-worn cocoon where he can pretend, however briefly, that life moves a little slower. He decides to stay, telling himself that a single extra hour won't derail his responsibilities, that he owes it to his own sense of balance to absorb an evening of normalcy whenever he can. There's something about the lighting, the scents, and the easy conversation drifting from booth to booth that soothes him, almost like a lullaby reminding him he's still connected to the simpler roots he often misses. Another sip from his fresh bottle, and he catches a faint reflection of the corner man in the glossy bar surface, a trick of light that reveals the slightest quiver in the man's clenched jaw, an agitation that can't easily be dismissed. Yet Mark maintains his composure, remembering the advice of an old friend who once told him that sometimes the best way to handle potential trouble is to let it reveal itself rather than invite it in. He bides his time, focusing instead on the comforting noise of the bar, the laughter that flares up again, the scrape of a chair against the floor, and the tinny echo of the jukebox's next track, an upbeat tune that signals the possibility of a changing mood. As the clock nears midnight, Mark can sense the gentle shift in the crowd, some patrons beginning to yawn and gather their coats, while others, perhaps reluctant to face the chilling wind outside or the quietude of an empty home, settle in more deeply, ordering another round. For a moment, he contemplates engaging the bartender in idle chat, maybe about the Red Sox or the unpredictable New England weather, any topic that might ground him more firmly in the present. Before he can muster the words, however, his attention is pulled once more toward the corner where the tall figure stands, now shifting his weight with a deliberate air, broadcasting the faint possibility that this calm may not last much longer. Mark's pulse quickens in the smallest increment, a subtle drumbeat of caution that resonates through his body. Yet he breathes slowly, reminding himself that he came here for peace, not a confrontation, and still holding on to the hope that he can simply enjoy a quiet evening without incident. With his second bottle nearly empty and his mind now oscillating between the comfort of the bar and the unease wrought by the stranger's presence, he slowly places the drink back on the counter, letting his hand linger on the cool glass, as if stalling for time. The decision to stay or go weighs on him like an invisible pivot point in the night, each option carrying its own uncertain consequences. He senses that something intangible is building beneath the surface of the bar's gentle atmosphere, a tension that crackles like static electricity, just waiting for the right moment to discharge. Yet, with a steadying breath and an inward vow to enjoy this rare slice of anonymity as long as fate will allow, Mark remains seated, preparing himself for whatever the night might bring as the bartender nods in silent solidarity, acknowledging that everyone who walks through this door carries a story, and Mark's is only just beginning to unfold this evening. Mark had barely finished savoring the last drop of his second bottle when a sudden shift in the bar's energy drew his attention to a scene unfolding near one of the corner booths, where a different man, taller, broader, and brimming with unchecked aggression, had begun intimidating a pair of younger patrons seated across from him, his booming voice cutting through the previously comfortable lull in the room. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket adorned with deep scratches that looked like scars from previous altercations, and though Mark couldn't quite make out every word, he could hear the unmistakable tone of threat that coiled around each sentence the man spat. It started with the bully leaning across the small, rickety table, jabbing a finger almost inches away from the chest of one of the patrons, who was visibly shrinking back, caught in that nerve-wracking space between indignation and fear. The other patron, a friend, presumably, tried to defuse the situation by raising placating hands and offering an apologetic shrug, but the menacing figure only scoffed and tightened his fists, knuckles whitening as if eager to make contact. Mark felt a jolt of concern slice through him, and he debated whether to intercede immediately or to wait and see if the aggressor would back down on his own, a fleeting hope that perhaps it was all a misunderstanding amplified by too many beers. Even the bartender seemed to sense the rising tension, pausing mid-polish of a glass and casting a wary glance in the direction of the commotion, the soft overhead lights revealing a flicker of concern in his tired eyes. In the background, The jukebox continued playing, its melancholic tune now feeling discordant against the harshness of the man's threats, as though the music itself recoiled from the harsh reality unfolding in front of it. The couple at the nearby table ceased their whispered conversation, their expressions turning from dreamy enchantment to uneasy vigilance, as though bracing themselves for the spark that might ignite into a full-blown altercation. Mark carefully rose from his barstool, determined not to incite the situation further but unwilling to remain a passive observer if the harassment escalated. He allowed himself a moment to gather his composure, drawing on that reservoir of courage shaped by years of training and the grounding ethos of his upbringing, which dictated that you stand up for those who can't easily do so themselves. As he took a measured step forward, his eyes zeroed in on the bully's posture. One shoulder angled threateningly, the other arm splayed out like a coiled whip ready to strike, his breath coming in ragged bursts that signaled an almost unstoppable momentum of rage. Each breath the man took seemed to stir the stale air around him, sending tiny ripples of tension throughout the bar, a silent warning that everyone present should brace themselves for the possibility of physical violence. The younger patrons exchanged anxious glances, words failing them as the man's barrage of insults rained down, each one sharper than the last, designed to humiliate and dominate without regard for dignity or reason. Amid the hush that had fallen over the rest of the bar, Mark felt a swell of empathy for these two, remembering a time in his own youth when confrontations like these were an unfortunate staple of his environment, shaping his sense of justice and fairness. He could see fear in their eyes, fear and a spark of pleading for help, and that alone was enough to strengthen his resolve. Sliding his empty bottle onto an adjacent table, Mark approached carefully, shoulders squared but not overtly challenging, his intention more to calm the situation than to stoke the flames. He lifted a hand in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture, voice calm but firm as he addressed the bully, asking if everything was all right and if there might be a way to discuss things without intimidation. The bully turned his head, those stormy eyes narrowing the instant they fell on Mark, as though the presence of a perceived alpha male threatened to steal the stage from him. A taut silence lingered for a moment, and Mark could feel the entire bar collectively holding its breath, everyone wondering if his gentle approach would defuse the conflict or simply shift the man's ire in his direction. The aggressor took a lumbering step forward, letting out a low, guttural laugh that resonated with a disturbing undercurrent of menace, an indication that he relished the attention and the chance to assert his dominance in front of a bigger audience. Without warning, he slammed one large, calloused hand on the table, rattling glasses and sending beer sloshing over the rim, while his other hand flexed at his side, a silent invitation for a fight that Mark was determined not to give. The two younger patrons, partially shielded now by Mark's presence, began to edge away, attempting to create distance between themselves and the unpredictable storm brewing at their table. Mark maintained steady eye contact, every muscle in his body coiled, ready to react if the situation demanded, yet hoping that reason might still find a foothold in the bully's alcohol-clouded mind. The bartender, sensing the volatility, edged closer with the phone in hand, likely ready to dial the authorities if fists started flying, though no one in the bar genuinely wanted the evening to end in flashing lights and legal complications. A faint scraping sound echoed as a few bar stools were pushed aside, patrons standing in a half-circle, curiosity and trepidation mingling in equal measure, many silently wondering whether they should intervene or hold back. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a disembodied warning that danger was never too far in this city, though no one paid it heed with the more immediate threat looming right in front of them. Mark found himself remembering a pivotal moment from his past, a scuffle in a similar bar years ago that had nearly derailed his life, fueling him to push forward with discipline and self-improvement rather than succumbing to the cycle of aggression. The bully, now locking eyes with Mark fully, sneered as recognition began to dawn, the kind of realization that often leads to an unsettling mixture of curiosity and hostility, especially in someone spoiling for a fight. Still, Mark held his ground, forcing his own pulse to slow, every breath deliberate, as though he could single-handedly quell the fury in the other man just by projecting calmness. Another crackling moment passed, the tension so thick it felt tangible, as though the very air were loaded with the potential for violence. and Mark hoped against hope that words might suffice where intimidation had already entrenched itself. Summoning a measured tone, Mark explained that nobody wanted trouble here tonight, least of all him, and that whatever the issue might be, it could be resolved without resorting to violence. The bully let out another hoarse chuckle, the sound scraping Mark's nerves like nails on a chalkboard, and for a moment, it seemed as if a bitter retort would be launched, further igniting the spark threatening to consume the room. Instead, the man merely pointed a thick finger in Mark's direction, his mouth curling into a twisted grin, as though he just recognized a worthy opponent, or perhaps a chance to elevate his own sense of importance by challenging someone famous. The ambient noise in the bar seemed to drop by a decibel, as if the swirling uncertainty had sucked the oxygen out of the space, leaving everyone present to wonder what would happen next. Mark, still determined to keep the peace, flicked a brief glance at the frightened patrons behind him, silently assuring them he had their back, even though his own heart pounded harder with each second. The bully's words emerged in a snarl, laced with cruelty and the deliberate malice of someone who thrives on fear, his voice vibrating with the dangerous resonance of a coiled viper ready to strike. Every muscle in Mark's body tensed involuntarily at the venom in that voice, his instincts pushing him to prepare for the possibility of an incoming blow, though his conscious mind willed him to keep still and non-confrontational. Across the bar, chairs squeaked as more onlookers rose, whether out of morbid curiosity or a genuine desire to assist if things turned ugly, while the jukebox continued to play in stark contrast to the growing chaos. Mark pictured the headlines that might follow if a fight broke out. Mark Wahlberg in bar brawl. A story that would overshadow the quiet purpose of why he was here and overshadow how he once again tried to defuse, not encourage, trouble. A bead of sweat slid down his temple as he fought to maintain composure, refusing to let the bully's verbal barbs draw him into a round of pointless machismo that could quickly spiral out of control. One of the younger men behind him stammered a quiet thank you, barely audible, which only heightened Mark's resolve to remain the line between their safety and this man's intimidation. In that moment, he realized the tall, brooding figure from earlier was no longer in the same spot, though he had no time to consider the implications as the bully took another step closer, each footfall a weighty threat. Mark's voice remained steady, a concentrated calm belying the adrenaline coursing through his veins, as he tried once more to de-escalate, perhaps drawing upon his experiences speaking to at-risk youth and channeling the empathy he had so often extended to those who'd lost their way. But all it took was the bully's brief snicker and a sideways tilt of his head to indicate that he wasn't ready to relent just yet, that the aggression coursing through him needed an outlet, preferably a physical one. The entire bar seemed to hover in suspended animation, each patron caught in the inertia of potential violence, uncertain whether to flee, watch, or lend a hand, while Mark alone held the nerve to stand directly in the path of chaos. The strain of the moment cast an odd hush over the scene, so quiet that Mark could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, accentuated by the shallow, ragged breathing of the bully, whose eyes darted around, seeking out weakness like a predator. The tension felt like a tangible force, swirling like a low fog around ankles, creeping up legs and coiling around throats, forcing shallow breaths and hushed tones. A final hush overtook the bar, as though the jukebox sensed the climax and fell silent in solidarity, leaving only the faint hum of the overhead lights to accompany the simmering dread. Mark thought of his family, of the example he wanted to set, and how every choice he made in these small but explosive moments contributed to a legacy far greater than himself, guiding his decision to persist in diffusing over instigating. Somewhere behind him, glass clinked against wood as someone set down a drink, a sudden and small sound that reverberated like a gunshot in the hush, prompting the bully to glance away momentarily, his unwavering hostility still radiating. In that fraction of a second, Mark caught the pained expression of the man he was trying to protect, and it served as a stark reminder that some people feel powerless in the face of aggression, relying on the bravery of strangers to save them from their darkest encounters. Emboldened by that realization, Mark offered the bully a final chance to step down gracefully, urging him to let it go, move on, and avoid a night that could otherwise end in shattered glass and shattered futures. This ultimatum hung in the air, the bully's face twisting as if processing an insult, and then, without warning, The man erupted, voice echoing off the walls as he barked at Mark to mind his own business if he didn't want to regret it for the rest of his life. The words struck with the force of a slap, potent and full of promised malice. But still Mark stood firm, refusing to budge, his expression resolute. There was no immediate blow, no immediate retreat. Just a deadlock of animosity and an uncertain hush, teetering on the brink of violence or perhaps an unlikely moment of uneasy peace, as the bar collectively held its breath to see which direction fate would tilt in the next fleeting seconds. Mark took a slow, measured breath, determined to keep his voice steady as he gently asked the bully to step back. But the very instant the man's eyes locked onto Mark's face, recognition lit up his features like a twisted spark of triumph, igniting a fresh wave of hostility that seemed to surge from deep within his chest. The instant realization this was no ordinary bystander, but Mark Wahlberg, an icon whose fame thrived on toughness and grit, poisoned whatever slim chance remained of a civil conversation, as the bully seized on the notion that besting Mark would be a trophy far more valuable than simply intimidating random bar patrons. He let out a low, humorless laugh that practically vibrated with vicious glee, stepping closer with an air of theatrical menace, as if the room were a stage and every onlooker merely an audience awaiting his grand performance. Mark raised his hands in a calm, open palm gesture, attempting to communicate that he neither wanted nor needed a fight, but the bully's twisted sneer only grew wider as he leaned in and spat. "So you think you're a big shot, huh? Think you can just waltz in here and play hero because everybody knows your name?" That mocking question hung in the stagnant air for a moment, intensifying the uneasy hush that had descended upon the bar since the conflict began, and Mark could sense the tension thickening as patrons held their breath in anticipation of his response. Keeping his voice low but confident, he tried to explain that fame had nothing to do with it, that he simply couldn't stand by while someone was being threatened. Yet his words seemed to crash against the man's hostility like a raindrop hitting hot metal, instantly evaporating. With a sneer, the bully curled his lip, jabbing a finger in Mark's direction as he proclaimed that Boston might have birthed Wahlberg's fame. But there were plenty of people in this town who remembered him before the flashing lights and red carpet appearances, lurking in the shadows eager to see him fall. The hostility in his eyes reflected something personal, a resentment that stretched far beyond celebrity envy, as though Mark's very existence symbolized everything he felt the world had denied him. Mark, ever watchful, noticed the quickening rise and fall of the man's chest, each inhale fueling the burning anger that coiled around him like a suffocating haze, ready to be unleashed at the slightest provocation. He tried once more to defuse the situation, pointing out that they were all just people trying to enjoy a night out, but the bully scoffed at that notion, claiming that Mark's celebrity gave him an unfair advantage in every aspect of life, an advantage that needed to be dismantled tonight. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, some seemingly torn between fascination and concern, while others clenched their jaws, bracing themselves for the inevitable explosion. The bartender, now standing behind the counter with a pale face, seemed uncertain whether to intervene or reach for the phone, torn between his responsibility to keep the peace and his fear of how swiftly things might escalate if he took sides. Mark caught the timid gaze of the two young patrons he had defended, both quietly slipping away from the table to put distance between themselves and the advancing inferno of rage, clearly aware that they no longer occupied the bully's focus. Despite the swirl of tension clogging the air, Mark tried to maintain a semblance of composure, recalling every self-control technique he'd honed over years of dealing with heated moments on set and in real life, determined to avoid giving this man the satisfaction of provoking him into a rash response. The bully, however, seemed to feed on the adrenaline of conflict, stepping forward again until the distance between him and Mark was reduced to a razor-thin line, each breath of rancid alcohol on his lips a stark reminder that reason might already be lost. Still, Mark locked eyes with the man, no trace of fear visible on his face, and asserted that nobody in this bar wanted trouble, least of all him, but if the bully insisted on seeking it, he would find only regret. The stranger barked out another harsh laugh, claiming regret wasn't in his vocabulary, and that seeing a big-time Hollywood star brought to his knees would be worth any price he might pay. Mark's heart pounded, a steady drumbeat that reminded him to stay grounded, even as a flurry of worst-case scenarios flashed through his mind, from broken glass and flying chairs to the arrival of law enforcement with cameras in tow. Another small group of patrons, sensing the electricity saturating the air, edged closer to the exit, as though preparing for a swift departure should the confrontation erupt into a full-blown brawl. Somewhere behind them, an older man with a heavily lined face shook his head in disapproval, muttering about how ego always seemed to destroy what could have been an otherwise peaceful evening. Sensing time slipping away, Mark spoke again, reminding the bully that there were better ways to handle anger, that neither fists nor intimidation would bring him any real satisfaction. But the man only roared back that Mark knew nothing about his life or the grievances that festered in his heart. A flicker of genuine pain crossed the bully's eyes, something raw and tormented, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Swallowed by the tidal wave of fury, he seemed determined to ride. Leaning in, he spat out a string of expletives aimed at Mark's so-called privileged life, his golden opportunities, and the luck that had propelled him to stardom, as if the entire concept of Mark's success existed solely to mock those who felt left behind. Mark sensed that the man's rage was not merely about recognition but also about a sense of injustice, the belief that the world had shunned him, and that Mark's presence reminded him of every door that had remained shut. Keeping his composure, Mark tried to find an avenue through the tempest of bitterness, telling the man that no one's journey was without struggle. But those words only seemed to fan the flames higher, as if the bully took them for condescension rather than empathy. At that moment, the bartender made a feeble attempt at diplomacy, suggesting that maybe everyone should calm down and have a drink on the house. But the aggressor spun around, hurling a torrent of insults at the bartender for daring to insert himself into something he couldn't possibly understand. A few onlookers recoiled at the venom in the bully's voice, and Mark couldn't help but notice how the man's entire body seemed to vibrate with tension. A rope pulled so taut that even the slightest nudge might snap it. His anger seemed to radiate outward, casting a poisonous aura across the bar that seeped into corners, infecting even those who tried to remain removed from the drama. Mark held his ground, his own breath shallow but controlled, his hand still raised slightly in a placating gesture, though his mind raced with strategies on how to deflect or block any potential strike the man might throw. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bar's front door in its frame, a lonely howl that underscored the rising storm within these four walls, each second bringing them closer to that precarious tipping point. The jukebox, as if sensing the tension, had gone silent in a moment of technological mercy, no longer providing a soundtrack to the escalating war of words. A bead of sweat traced its way down Mark's temple, though his expression remained resolute, and he refused to blink under the bully's glare, silently demonstrating that intimidation would earn him nothing. The bully's voice, low and rough, dripped with disdain as he flung a final threat. If Mark truly thought he could lecture him on choices and consequences, perhaps he should be prepared to prove his words with action. The challenge was clear, a gauntlet thrown onto the dusty ground, echoing in the stillness as the bully's fists flexed at his sides, heavy with pent-up violence. Mark paused, taking one last attempt at a calm approach, his words carefully chosen as he pointed out that real strength was in self-restraint, in lifting up those around you instead of tearing them down. The bully let out another raucous laugh, twisting his face into an expression that seethed with scorn, ridiculing Mark's notion of honor as nothing but a pathetic facade used to sell movie tickets. That insult stung, but Mark refused to let it show, though he felt a hot tide of anger threatening to surge within him, pushing against his internal bulwark of composure. Another patron emerged from the crowd, an older woman wearing a concerned frown, and tried to place a gentle hand on the bully's arm, urging him to think twice. But he shrugged her off violently, the abrupt motion shoving her back a few steps before someone caught her from behind. Any lingering hope that Mark could defuse this peacefully with words alone shrank in that instant, replaced by an ever-growing sense of inevitability that the man needed a tangible force to stop him. The tension in the bar was now so intense that it almost felt like a living entity, crawling over everyone's skin and filling their lungs with acrid dread, as though the building itself quaked in anticipation of what was to come. Mark gritted his teeth, steeling himself for the possibility that diplomatic efforts had failed, and he might have to defend himself, though he loathed the thought of it turning into a spectacle or, worse yet, an ugly rumor about how he brawled with an angry patron. The bully locked eyes with Mark once more, and in that singular exchange, it was clear he was seeking validation through violence, craving the moment he could claim he stood toe-to-toe with a famed actor and walked away victorious. Another long second of silence gripped the room, giving Mark time to reflect on how this moment carried more weight than just a personal altercation. It mirrored a struggle between decency and unchecked aggression, with every witness silently hoping reason would prevail. But reason had been stamped out, overshadowed by the thrill of a potential fight and the bitterness etched into the bully's very core. A bitterness that Mark now feared no gentle word could penetrate. Finally, the bully's frustration reached its boiling point, and with a furious snarl, he lunged forward, fingers splayed in a grappling motion aimed at Mark's collar, determined to yank him down to his level in one swift, punishing move. Mark instinctively sidestepped, mindful that unleashing a barrage of strikes could escalate the chaos beyond control, but prepared nonetheless to counter if the man left him no choice. Gasps erupted from the crowd as the bully's momentum carried him a half-step past Mark, forcing him to pivot with a snarl, eyes glinting with animalistic rage. Mark exhaled slowly, assuming a balanced stance while silently cursing the fact that diplomacy had failed, yet still resolved to end this confrontation with as little harm as possible. All around them, eyes widened and breaths caught in throats, the tension spiking to a fever pitch in anticipation of the next strike, the entire bar feeling like a tightly wound spring ready to snap at the faintest tremor. The bully snarled again, reorienting his stance and hurling insults about how Mark's movie training wouldn't save him in a real fight, obviously itching to prove that claim. Mark, voice calm despite the racing of his heart, offered one final warning. If the bully insisted on violence, he would respond, but he was giving him every opportunity to stand down. Instead of retreating, the bully roared, "You want to be a hero? Then fight like one." And with that, the last vestige of doubt vanished from the man's savage gaze, replaced by an almost gleeful hunger for the brawl he'd been courting all night. Mark braced himself for the inevitable clash, adrenaline pumping through his veins like a rapid current. But as the bully launched into another verbal tirade, it quickly became apparent that there was something far deeper fueling his rage than simple envy or a thirst for a cheap thrill, something personal and simmering beneath the surface that had driven him to single Mark out in the first place. Sentence by sentence, the bully spat out cryptic references to a past injustice, circling around the details like a predator, only hinting that Mark's very name had become synonymous in his mind with shattered dreams and broken promises, festering for years until it festered into this volcanic hatred. He raged about life in Boston's tougher streets, claiming that while Mark had ascended to stardom, countless people, including himself, had been left behind, gripped by poverty and despair, never once receiving the same miraculous breaks or a beacon of hope to shine on their futures. The bully's words crackled with scorn, describing how he had idolized Mark's early success only to discover, in his darkest days, that Mark's fame felt like a personal reminder of every failure he had ever experienced, every opportunity that never materialized. With a trembling voice teetering between anger and anguish, he shouted about how the city cheered Mark on but never bothered to notice ordinary folks like him, those who'd grown up in the same neighborhoods but never found the magical elevator that led to fortune and renown. Mark, in turn, tried to reason with him to show empathy for the struggles that shaped the man's fury, but the bully cut him off viciously, insisting it was too late for compassion from someone who symbolized everything he despised. Each sentence tumbled out with an unfiltered bitterness, accompanied by the metallic tang of desperation that only the truly resentful can wield, and Mark could sense that the bully was teetering on the brink of emotional collapse, ready to explode at any moment. Fighting was one thing, Mark thought, but confronting the twisted combination of envy, disappointment, and betrayal that flickered in the man's eyes was something else entirely, and he found himself grappling for the right words to de-escalate a vendetta that appeared bone-deep. The man recalled an incident from years ago, something about a local charity event Mark headlined, a scene that had left the bully feeling overlooked as he stood in line for hours hoping to talk to Mark, only to be turned away at the last minute because of schedule constraints. An apparently trivial moment that carved a scar of rejection in his memory. With every syllable, his hostility seemed to metastasize into a raw confession of how he had spent subsequent years blaming Mark for every shortfall and disappointment that befell him, forging a psychological link between Mark's thriving career and his own perpetual misfortune. He spat out that he had tried to find a stable job, tried to get his family's life together, tried to conquer the demons that trailed him, but he inevitably saw Mark on movie posters, magazine covers, or talk shows, exuding confidence and success, reminding him of all the ways in which he fell short. The bully ranted about how society could forgive Mark's old missteps, his turbulent youth, his brushes with the law, so long as he was famous, but it never offered second chances to nameless men who lacked the allure of celebrity. Mark listened, feeling a knot of compassion and regret tighten in his chest, realizing that the bully, however unhinged, was bearing a soul battered by years of feeling invisible in a world that worshipped winners. But the more Mark tried to respond with understanding, the more the bully's eyes narrowed in suspicion, as if kindness was an insult, a condescending pat on the head unworthy of the jagged edges scarring his heart. He proclaimed that Mark stood for privilege, luck, and the hypocrisy of forgiving some while damning others, and that it was time someone forced him to see the pain festering in the forgotten cracks of their shared hometown. With trembling fists, he demanded that Mark atone for all the broken dreams and empty stomachs that had lined their neighborhood streets, as though a single confrontation could rewrite years of systemic hardship. The onlookers, once mere spectators, now seemed torn between shock and a somber recognition that while the bully's fury was misplaced and dangerous, it was also born of a genuine sense of betrayal that many of them, in quieter moments, might have empathized with. Mark, fighting to maintain composure, tried again to soothe the man, reminding him that he still donated to local communities, supported youth programs, and never turned his back on the city that had shaped him. But the bully dismissed these contributions as self-serving publicity stunts. The tension rose another notch as the bully's voice cracked with raw emotion, a mixture of rage and grief compelling him to brandish his accusations like weapons, each one slicing the air with palpable bitterness. He described how every day he struggled to put food on the table, watch his loved ones slip away into despair, and see the world cheer for Mark's every success, an experience that ate away at his psyche until resentment metamorphosed into a personal vendetta. As the bully's monologue continued, Mark began to grasp the depth of the wound, realizing that even if the man's anger was unwarranted or misguided, it was undeniably real, a manifestation of generational hardship that ran deeper than a single bar confrontation. The overhead lights cast stark shadows across both men's faces, illuminating the bully's trembling jaw and Mark's solemn expression, which silently conveyed that while he might not fully comprehend the magnitude of the man's pain, he refused to dismiss it as mere drunken ranting. In the background, the bartender hovered with the phone clutched in clammy hands, uncertain whether to call the police or allow Mark another chance to calm this raging tempest, conscious that an intervention by law enforcement could shatter what little fragile peace remained. The crowd, too, collectively leaned in, hushed, as if they had realized the stakes had evolved beyond a typical bar fight into something far more tragic and deeply human. A lifetime of resentment seeking a scapegoat, and Mark's celebrity status offering the perfect, albeit undeserving, target. Every new word that exploded from the bully's mouth was loaded with personal history. Snippets of heartbreak, fatherless nights, hungry siblings, and the soul-crushing weight of watching others soar while he felt perpetually chained to the ground. Mark felt a pang of sympathy, his own memories stirring as he recalled the rough edges of his own youth, the times he nearly lost himself to anger and poor decisions, the moments he'd counted on second chances to stay afloat. Yet acknowledging that he, too, had experienced hardship did nothing to quell the bully's torrent of blame, which found fresh channels every time Mark tried to relate, as though any sign of understanding only reminded the man of all he had lost. The bully's voice rose in a crescendo of bitterness, describing a turning point when he vowed that if he ever encountered Mark face to face, he'd make him pay for the anguish he represented, for the life he believed Mark stole from everyone else in that old neighborhood. Tears threatened to break in the man's eyes, but pride and anger kept them at bay, forging them into a hard glint that gave Mark chills, a testament to how profoundly heartbreak can calcify into fury. Outside, a gust of wind howled, rattling the door as if nature itself sensed the storm churning in the bar, pressing its own restless spirit against the fraught interior scene. Mark, struggling to maintain a foothold of calm, mustered a sincere apology for any moment the man felt overlooked, any charity event where he was turned away, or any sense of local loyalty that may have seemed forsaken. But the bully responded by slamming a fist against the wall, leaving a dull thud echoing off the rafters. The sudden violence sent a tremor through the assembled patrons, some of whom instinctively backed away, while others exchanged anxious looks, fearing the final plunge into physical conflict was near. The bully, undeterred, hurled a volley of curses at Mark, demanding that he answer for his success, for the pride the city took in his accomplishments, for every heartbreak that overshadowed the fleeting promise that maybe, one day, men like him could follow the same path. Mark began to speak again, but the bully roared over him, accusing him of hiding behind polished interviews and philanthropic masks, riling himself up to the point where every breath shuddered with suppressed violence. In that moment, Mark felt certain that the man was on the brink of lashing out physically, driven not simply by a need to injure, but by a tangled desire to prove that even an idolized celebrity could be humiliated, forced to confront the raw truths of the streets he'd left behind. A ripple of fear coursed through Mark's gut as he imagined how easily this desperate man could cause real damage, not just to him, but to innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of a misguided vendetta. Still, Mark refused to shrink away, meeting the bully's gaze with steady resolve, determined to show that there was a chance, no matter how slight, to transform this roiling anger into something less destructive. The bully, however, seemed consumed by a need to lash out, pushing closer to Mark until they were nearly nose to nose, each breath a hot gust of acrimony and repressed sorrow. The entire bar braced, uncertain if Mark would finally strike back, or whether the bully's next move would be one that left broken bones and shattered glass in its wake. Several patrons took shallow, fearful breaths, while a few stealthily positioned themselves behind tables or chairs, ready to intervene or duck if it came to that. Every passing second was like a drumbeat driving the tension higher, reminding everyone that resolution hovered at a precarious juncture between redemption and violence, with the bully's personal vendetta fueling the flames. Mark stood rigid, determined not to react on raw instinct, struggling to find a middle ground between defending himself and showing understanding for the broken man's plight, uncertain if such a middle ground even existed in the face of so much pent-up anger. At last, the bully slammed his other hand against the table, rattling leftover glasses, tears of fury mingling with the sweat that clung to his brow, and he shouted for Mark to stop being a coward, to fight him as if that would prove something real and tangible amid all the illusions of fame. In that charged instant, Mark glimpsed the heartbreak beneath the venom, sensing that this confrontation was less about him personally and more about a bruised soul demanding the universe acknowledge his pain. Yet he also knew that if the man refused to see reason, their talk would devolve into fists, a possibility that tied Mark's stomach in knots, making him dread the headlines and the looming regret of a fight he never wanted. Holding his stance, Mark offered one final entreaty, urging the bully to recognize that pouring out his anguish this way would never heal the trauma of his past or fix the injustice life had thrown at him. Yet the man's face only hardened, tears giving way to blazing resentment. The standoff lingered like a massive storm cloud, heavy and dark, pregnant with thunder, each second feeling like a crackle of lightning that might strike and leave destruction in its wake, the entire bar paralyzed by the rawness of the moment. And so the bully, breathing heavily, locked eyes with Mark, a single tear finally escaping as he vowed that Mark's comfortable illusions would shatter tonight, and in the same breath, he let out a guttural roar that signaled he would hold nothing back in his quest to bring Mark down to his level. In that charged moment, just as the bully roared out his determination to destroy every illusion he believed Mark represented, the tall, brooding figure who had stood in the corner earlier emerged from the shadows, striding forward with a sense of urgency that sliced through the suffocating tension, his voice resonating with authority as he demanded everyone step back. The sudden reappearance of this mysterious man, whose presence had been so easy to overlook in the heat of conflict, startled the onlookers, and even the bully momentarily paused his tirade, jaw clenched and nostrils flaring, unsure whether to redirect his fury toward this new interloper. A hush fell over the bar as every patron, including Mark and the trembling bartender, turned their gaze to this figure, a man whose deeply lined face bore the unmistakable marks of a life shaped by secrets and regrets, and whose dark coat draped him in an almost spectral air. With painstaking calm, the man locked eyes first on the bully and then on Mark, as if weighing a grave decision, his voice surprisingly steady when he finally spoke to reveal that this confrontation wasn't simply a random clash between two men from the same rough streets, but a collision of family. In a single sentence that shredded the night's logic, he divulged that Mark and the bully shared the same father, an explosive truth that nearly buckled the bully's knees and left Mark speechless, his mind spinning in a swirl of disbelief at this revelation that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his own upbringing. At first, the words didn't fully register in the bully's mind. He even let out a growl of denial, accusing the tall man of lying just to protect Mark. Yet the stranger pulled a faded envelope from his coat pocket, explaining in painstaking detail that he had once worked for Mark's father and possessed personal knowledge of an affair that resulted in a child no one acknowledged. Everyone in the bar stood in stunned silence, the sense of shock palpable as the alleged half-brothers stared at each other, locked in a paralyzing mix of rage, confusion, and raw vulnerability. Their conflict abruptly flipped on its head. Mark, for his part, felt 1,000 emotions surge up from his core. Betrayal, curiosity, even a twisted sense of guilt, as if by some cosmic injustice his success had inadvertently masked the existence of someone who shared his own blood. The bully, reeling from the claim, demanded to know why the man waited all these years to reveal the truth, his anger stumbling into heartbreak as he recalled every lonely night, every hungry day, every shimmering hope that had turned to bitterness under the assumption that fate had cursed him alone. The tall figure's answer was painful to hear. Mark's father had refused to acknowledge the child, fearful of scandal and the disruption it would bring to his already complicated family life. By the time regret set in, it was too late, and the guilt-ridden father's health deteriorated before he found the courage to disclose the secret. A horrified murmur rippled through the onlookers, some bowing their heads in empathy for the bully, others glancing at Mark with newfound pity, recognizing that what should have been a private reckoning had erupted into a public maelstrom. Tears finally escaped the bully's eyes as he demanded proof, real proof, his entire frame trembling with pent-up grief that had just found a devastating explanation. While Mark stood rooted to the spot, words failing him in the face of a revelation that shattered his prior understanding of his own past. The tall man admitted that he too had once tried to contact Mark, but found his efforts blocked by layers of publicists and schedules, a bureaucracy so thick that it hardly felt personal, even if Mark himself had never known any of it was happening behind the scenes. The air in the bar felt even heavier than before, but now it was no longer charged by aggression alone. It was thick with sorrow, a sorrow that permeated the dimly lit space like a fog, settling over everyone present as they began to grasp the magnitude of this new truth. Unable to contain his heartbreak, the bully stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of a table for support, his eyes darting between Mark and the envelope clutched in the tall man's hand, a lifetime of resentment colliding with the sudden possibility that it had all been rooted in a lie of omission. Mark, heart pounding in his chest, stepped forward hesitantly, still reeling from the knowledge that he might have a half-brother he never knew about, and that this brother's suffering could be linked to choices made by their father years ago. The bully, overcome with a mixture of fury and longing, swung his gaze back to Mark, lips trembling as he hurled accusations of abandonment. Yet his voice faltered when he saw the genuine confusion and regret written plainly on Mark's face. A hush so intense it seemed unreal gripped the bar, as though time itself stood still while the tall man elaborated on details. Dates, locations, a testament from a relative who had once whispered the secret on a deathbed. The final puzzle pieces painting a picture both tragic and inescapably convincing. Whispers spread among the patrons, some covering their mouths in shock, others glancing at the bully with compassion, recalling how violence sometimes sprouts from wounds inflicted long ago. Wounds nobody ever properly tends to. Mark tried to speak, voice quivering with sincerity, insisting he had never known, that he had grown up struggling too, not realizing that a sibling, cast adrift by circumstances, lurked on the other side of the city. The bully's tears turned into an anguished sob, his rage flickering like a weakened flame that had lost its fuel, as the revelation that he shared blood with Mark threatened to uproot the very foundation of hatred he had so carefully built. Even the bartender, who had been on the verge of calling the police minutes ago, now simply watched with moist eyes, the phone forgotten in his hand, as the tragedy of miscommunication and injustice overshadowed any thought of a conventional bar brawl. The tall man, voice husky with what seemed like his own guilt, confessed that he'd promised Mark's father he would someday make this right, but fear, time, and the unpredictability of Mark's fame had complicated every attempt, culminating in tonight's accidental collision. Silence clenched the room so tightly that every quiet sob, every shuddering exhale, seemed amplified tenfold, as the bully, Mark's newly revealed half-brother, slumped into a chair, head in hands, releasing a torrent of muffled curses directed more at fate than at Mark. Mark, unable to stand idly by, cautiously approached and placed a tentative hand on the man's shoulder, torn between his own swirl of grief and the urge to comfort, uncertain if the bully would lash out again or finally accept the outstretched arm of a sibling he never expected to claim. The tension that had once threatened to erupt in violence now mutated into a shared heartbreak, a communal recognition that this was no ordinary bar fight, but the unearthing of a secret so harrowing it left even the rowdiest patrons lost for words. Though a faint part of him still braced for a blow, Mark found himself kneeling beside the bully, urging him to look up, trying to convey that, while nothing could erase the years of pain, there might be a chance for understanding if they both laid down their weapons of anger. A quake of confusion passed through the bully's face before he finally raised his eyes, a glint of resentment still there, but now tempered by a nascent flicker of recognition, the possibility that maybe Mark wasn't the heartless enemy he had imagined. The tall man, holding the envelope as though it were a sacred relic, cleared his throat and said he had documents, letters that Mark's father never had the courage to send, a testament to regret and cowardice that might shed light on a father's unspoken remorse. Mark's voice cracked as he asked to see them, but the bully pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes, battling fresh tears, debating whether he could handle the emotional blow of reading those letters here in front of strangers, in the very bar where he'd come itching for a fight. A trembling hush surrounded them, the once loud bar now hauntingly silent, a congregation of empathic witnesses to the unraveling of a lifetime's worth of darkness, with no one entirely sure how to proceed. Suddenly, the bullied patrons from earlier stepped up, gingerly offering the bully a glass of water, their fear replaced by compassion after seeing how deeply wounded he truly was, and the bully accepted it with a nod that spoke more than words. In a strained voice, Mark apologized again, not just for tonight's altercation, but for the invisible barriers that had kept him ignorant of his half-brother's existence, effectively robbing them both of a chance at a meaningful bond. The bully's lips quivered, but he didn't speak immediately, likely wrestling with the conflicting emotions of anger, betrayal, envy, and the faintest glimmer of hope for some kind of belated reconciliation. The bartender, who had seen countless scuffles in his time, admitted softly that never before had he witnessed an argument turn so sharply into a revelation, a testament to the unpredictable cruelty and strange grace life sometimes employs. Mark hovered by the man's side, unsure whether a touch would help or sting, but unwilling to abandon him now that he understood how deeply their lives were intertwined by blood and loss. An uncomfortable churn of emotions swept through the bar, as some patrons recognized they were privy to a deeply personal moment, yet found themselves unable to tear their gaze away from the raw humanity unfolding before them. In the corner, the older woman who had earlier tried to calm the bully dabbed her eyes with a napkin, muttering how families can tear each other apart even when they don't realize they share the same roots. Gradually, the bully's ragged breathing slowed, and he sucked in a shaky breath, wiping his eyes on his sleeve, glancing sideways at Mark, who, despite his obvious shock and distress, still looked ready to stand beside him rather than against him. All at once, the enveloping swirl of heartbreak pulsed with a curious, cautious hush of possibility. The first step toward bridging a chasm that had lain hidden for decades, overshadowed by secrecy and shame. The tall man seemed spent, his burden partially lifted by finally disclosing the truth, though his posture remained stooped by the reality that his involvement had come too late to spare either brother from years of unmerited hatred. Mark tried to form words of solace or apology or anything that might put meaning to this moment, but the tremor in his voice threatened to break him, so he simply remained close, letting the bully see that he was not turning away. With the faintest rasp, the bully asked why their father never had the courage to claim him, to make an effort to unify the family, and for the first time, Mark realized he, too, had no answers, only heartbreak. An unspoken understanding coursed between them, a shared sense of betrayal by a man who had obviously been flawed, who had chosen denial over truth, leaving this painful inheritance for them to discover by chance on a night meant for quiet escape. And so the bar, which had been mere moments from erupting into a violent spectacle, found itself swallowed by a compassion-laced silence, all eyes resting on these two men who had discovered a bond no one, least of all them, had anticipated. A single tear rolled down Mark's cheek as he glanced around, seeing empathy instead of fear in the patrons' faces, each reflecting the universal ache of family wounds, of lives fractured by secrets, longing for closure and communion. The bully, voice still trembling, confessed that never in a million years had he expected to find out Mark wasn't just an emblem of success to resent, but flesh and blood, part of his story whether he liked it or not, forever bound by that ancient paternal link. Mark could only nod, at a loss for words, a swirl of sorrow, gratitude, and cautious relief swirling in his chest. For while the truth was agonizing, it also offered a step toward genuine connection. A sniffle broke the silence, the bartender discreetly handing a couple of tissues to the men. His once dreaded phone call to the police rendered unnecessary by the metamorphosis of a near-brawl into a cathartic family reckoning. Outside, the wind still rattled the windows, but it no longer felt ominous. More like a grief-laden lullaby that serenaded the bar's patrons as they witnessed the extraordinary transformation of hatred into a different kind of reckoning altogether. It was only then, as the final tears fell, that Mark realized the entire trajectory of the night, indeed of his and the bully's entire lives, had just been irrevocably changed by this shocking revelation, a twist that left him breathless at the threshold of an uncertain but profoundly important new chapter. Mark's half-brother, eyes still wet and voice quivering, drew a shaky breath and offered the letter-filled envelope to Mark with trembling hands, urging him to read what their father had written. A poignant request that instantly hushes the bar into a reverent silence, as though everyone recognizes this as the threshold of an extraordinary reckoning. Struggling to steady his own hands, Mark carefully slipped out a series of yellowed pages, each bearing the unmistakable scrawl of a man who had once haunted his own childhood and, unbeknownst to him, also shaped the life of the man he had nearly fought mere moments ago. The paper emitted a faint, musty scent that evoked dusty attics and long-hidden secrets, gripping the attention of every patron now leaning in, bracing themselves for a final revelation that might redeem or condemn the memory of a father who had chosen denial over responsibility. Mark's voice trembled as he began to read the words aloud, quietly enough to preserve some privacy, yet loud enough for his half-brother and the immediate circle of onlookers to catch each weighty syllable, the raw confession of a father tormented by regret. He had feared the scandal, the demands, and the shattering of an already complicated home life, so he fled from a truth that pained him every single day since. Each sentence wove an intricate tapestry of guilt and love, as though their father had wrestled with how to leave something resembling an apology, even if he never mustered the courage to face the consequences in life, and Mark's voice caught more than once on the heartbreak embedded in the old man's words. Unable to hold back tears, Mark's half-brother choked out that he had read this letter 1,000 times, hating every syllable for arriving far too late, resentful that a father's love could be withheld so easily from one child while being showered, apparently so, from his perspective, upon another. A few of the nearby patrons pressed hands to their mouths, marveling at the vulnerability unfolding before them, grasping that the intensity of this moment transcended mere gossip or spectacle, veering into the realm of raw human frailty. Mark's voice faltered when he reached the part where their father admitted to watching Mark's growing success with a mixture of pride and shame, each newspaper clipping a reminder of the life he'd nurtured in one son and abandoned in another. The hush inside the bar felt as thick as fog, and even the old jukebox seemed to sense it should remain silent, as if the entire building stood in awe of a confessional so profound that no melody could possibly underscore its gravity. Mark's half-brother, amid his tears, demanded to know why nobody had tried to reach out sooner, addressing this question to both Mark and the tall man who had brought the envelope, but the answer was steeped in complexities. Scheduling barriers, fear of rejection, the father's own self-imposed secrecy, and the labyrinth of shame that overshadowed every attempt. A strangled sound escaped Mark's throat as he apologized over and over, promising he had never known, that he had grown up wrestling his own demons and hardships, completely oblivious to a half-sibling who was facing an even more harrowing struggle. While a painful kernel of resentment still gleamed in his half-brother's eyes, it started to soften under the weight of Mark's sincerity, and a hesitant flicker of empathy wove through the tension, suggesting the possibility of a fragile bond beginning to form. Together, they realized that the one person who might have offered them both closure, their father, was no longer there to answer for his choices, leaving them to pick up the pieces and decide whether to build a bridge or burn the remnants of their shared bloodline. Patron by patron, the bar's audience recognized the gravity of this threshold, stepping back to give the brothers space, many with tears in their eyes, haunted by how swiftly anger could be reborn as anguish once the hidden truths of a family tragedy were exposed. The tall man, who had once hovered near the sidelines, seemed both relieved and remorseful, acknowledging that it was never his place to control how or when this secret would be revealed, but circumstances forced his hand tonight, for better or worse. An unspoken question filled every still corner of the room. Would the two men choose forgiveness, or had the damage already run too deep to ever be undone by a father's belated confessions? Mark, bowing his head, carefully refolded the brittle letters and held them against his chest, as though clutching the physical embodiment of all the apologies and lost moments that could never be retrieved. His half-brother inhaled shakily, knuckles pressed to his lips, wrestling with the shock of having torn down walls he'd built over a lifetime only to find a grief-stricken sibling rather than the smug, privileged idol he had once imagined. A few of the bar's patrons, emboldened by the shifting energy, approached to offer quiet words of comfort, no longer seeing the bully or the movie star, but two men contending with the aftermath of a father's secret. The bartender finally placed the phone aside, recognizing that the emergency had transformed into something far more nuanced than a mere brawl, and that the healing, if it came, would emerge from compassion rather than police intervention. With trembling hands, Mark reached out, and for a tentative moment, his half-brother stared at that extended arm, torn between the desire to lash out and the longing for connection he'd never known was possible. When at last the man accepted the gesture, gripping Mark's forearm, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the bar, an exhalation of shared relief, empathy, and cautious hope that perhaps some measure of redemption was within reach. Their clasp was not exactly a brotherly embrace. It was laced with pain, confusion, and the specter of a father who had failed them both. Yet it was the first tangible olive branch bridging a divide that had once felt insurmountable. Slowly, the older woman who had attempted to calm the bully earlier stepped closer, gently advising them to talk somewhere more private, urging that they each deserved the chance to dissect this revelation without the weight of so many eyes upon them. Mark, swallowing hard, agreed, but not before turning to the gathered crowd, who had borne witness to the entire ordeal, and issuing an earnest apology for the disruption and any fear their confrontation might have caused. A wave of understanding passed through the patrons, many nodding in acknowledgement, none voicing criticism. The events had spiraled far beyond a typical bar altercation into a stage upon which heartbreak and the hope of reconciliation played out in real time. Clinking glasses, hushed whispers, and sympathetic murmurs replaced what could have been chaos, and it struck Mark that he might forever recall this little bar as the place where his life's narrative took a turn so unexpected it nearly upended every assumption he held. His half-brother, still rubbing tears from the corners of his eyes, confessed in a strained whisper that he wasn't ready to forgive their father. Maybe he never would, but perhaps he could learn not to resent Mark anymore, assuming Mark was willing to give him a chance to process it all. Mark, voice shaking, promised that whatever it took, he would make room in his life for this man whose pain had once manifested as violence, but now radiated with the vulnerability of a soul lost in the shadows, finally stepping into the light. He acknowledged that it wouldn't be an easy path, but that the letters, the regrets, and the unspoken bond of shared blood demanded more than a cold parting of ways. A shiver passed through the assembled onlookers as they bore witness to a sort of closure beginning to take shape, however tentative, leaving them all with a renewed sense that even the darkest secrets could yield fragile new beginnings if confronted with honesty. In that tender moment, the bartender cleared his throat, politely offering water, tissues, and whatever else they might need. A simple gesture that somehow encapsulated the unity that had blossomed from an evening which had initially seemed poised for violence. Outside, the wind rattled the windows again, but this time it felt almost cathartic, as if nature itself was exhaling along with the men and women who had just lived through a story none of them would soon forget. Slowly, Mark and his half-brother gathered their composure, stepping away from the center of the room to a quieter corner, guided by the tall man who had overseen the entire revelation, as the rest of the bar retreated to give them space. Mark promised everyone that, once matters were settled, he would do his best to return and properly thank them for their understanding, feeling a surge of gratitude for how this small Boston establishment had unexpectedly become the crucible for confronting a shattered family truth. Though the atmosphere remained heavy with the echoes of heartbreak, something akin to hope began to permeate the air, a collective yearning to believe that this story could end with at least one step toward healing. The bully, now simply known as Mark's half-brother, managed a faint, trembling nod, his features etched with exhaustion, as if the avalanche of revelations had drained every last ounce of his fury, leaving room for a grief-chiseled acceptance. Standing by the scuffed bar counter, Mark's hand still clutched the envelope of letters like a fragile lifeline, each page a reminder of the father whose choices had created a gulf between them, yet also offered a narrow bridge toward understanding. Tears glimmered unshed in his eyes, but he refused to let bitterness rule the moment, silently vowing that he would do everything in his power to ensure his half-brother no longer felt invisible or marginalized, no matter how complicated the journey might be. The bartender silently refilled a glass with water and slid it over to Mark, who offered a grateful nod, heart pounding with a mixture of sorrow, relief, and a strange anticipation for what the future might hold. Settling onto a bar stool, Mark's half-brother finally managed to speak at length about the hardships that had defined him. Stories of hunger, lost jobs, broken relationships, bared now without the hateful filter of envy, and Mark listened earnestly, bridging a lifetime of misunderstanding with empathy. In that tenuous honesty, they discovered a fragile thread of kinship, both men acknowledging that they had survived their own forms of adversity, though only now did they see how deeply their stories were woven together. The tall man, part witness, part instigator of these events, hovered nearby, occasionally clarifying details or offering a quiet affirmation of the truths he had helped deliver, regret etched on his features for having waited so long. Around them, the bar's patrons resumed muted conversation, some wiping away tears, others exchanging glances that conveyed profound sympathy, their hearts still tender from witnessing such a raw, life-altering epiphany. Eventually, the old jukebox stirred from its silence, clicking over to a gentle, wistful tune that drifted through the air, as if to underscore the possibility of reconciliation, the notes delicate but insistent in their soft optimism. Mark, recalling how the night began with a simple desire for anonymity and a cold beer, realized how surreal it felt to find himself at the center of such a deeply personal drama, the entire bar entwined in this improbable family saga. By the time the final notes of the song faded, both men looked at each other with expressions that spoke not of enmity, but of an unspoken question. Where do we go from here? An older patron, wearing a red Sox cap, finally broke the hush by toasting the two men, lifting a glass in a silent pledge that healing, however slow, was worth pursuing, and a small chorus of patrons followed suit. Mark's half-brother, eyes glassy with fresh tears, lifted his own glass, unsteady hand and all, and tapped it gently to Mark's, a wordless promise that, for the first time in their lives, they would face the future not as adversaries but as men bound by the possibility of genuine understanding. And so, in a dimly lit Boston bar that had borne witness to the explosive crescendo of years of bitterness, the final revelation left everyone marveling at the inexplicable ways fate can twist the threads of life, threading the needle of hope through even the deepest wounds, and in that awe-filled moment, the confrontation found its true conclusion.